I'm Sophia, 34, and 3 days ago I became a widow. My husband Greg died in a Chicago hotel room on what his company called a routine business trip. But when I called his office, his HR director shattered my world. "Ma'am, Greg quit 6 months ago. We have no record of any business travel. For half a year, he left every Monday in pressed suits, kissed me goodbye, and came home Friday with stories of meetings and clients. He even showed me paycheck stubs. None of it was real. What was Greg really doing with those missing days?" The deeper I dig, the more I realize the husband I knew died long before that hotel room, and the truth about his secret life will change everything. If you've ever wondered how well you really know the person sleeping next to you, like and subscribe for stories that will make you question everything. I'm sitting in our living room, staring at the wedding photo album spread across the coffee table. 7 years ago, Greg and I looked so happy, so certain about our future together. His arm wrapped around my waist, both of us beaming at the camera. With that naive confidence that comes with believing you know everything about the person you're marrying. We met at a marketing conference in Denver. I was presenting on digital campaign strategies, and he approached afterward with genuine curiosity about my work. Our courtship was everything I'd dreamed of: long conversations over coffee, weekend hiking trips, shared dreams of starting our own consulting firm someday. Greg was methodical, thoughtful, the kind of man who remembered the little things. When he proposed on the anniversary of our first date, presenting a ring he designed himself, I knew I'd found my person. The wedding was perfect, intimate, meaningful, surrounded by people who genuinely celebrated our love. For the first 4 years, everything felt effortless. We bought this house together, a 1920s craftsman that needed work but had character. Greg threw himself into renovation projects with systematic precision, transforming our kitchen from a dated disaster into something magazine-worthy. His job at Meridian Financial seemed stable, if demanding. He worked as a senior analyst, reviewing investment portfolios and advising high-net-worth clients. The travel started gradually, a day trip here, an overnight there. By year 5, he was gone Monday through Friday most weeks, explaining that his client base had expanded to include Fortune 500 companies requiring on-site consultations. I never questioned it. Greg brought home detailed stories about difficult clients, frustrating hotel experiences, delayed flights. He'd show me photos of boring conference rooms and complain about terrible coffee in Minneapolis or aggressive air conditioning in Phoenix. He even kept hotel key cards on his dresser, little trophies from his travels that I found endearing. The routine became our new normal. Monday morning kisses goodbye, his black rolling suitcase by the door, the promise to call when he landed. Friday evening reunions where he'd collapse on the couch, exhausted but happy to be home, usually with some small gift, my favorite chocolate from a shop he discovered, or a funny postcard from the airport. Those weekend hours together felt precious because of their scarcity. We'd sleep in Saturday mornings, make elaborate breakfasts, catch up on the week's events. Sunday afternoons were for grocery shopping and meal prep, Greg carefully selecting ingredients for dinners he'd cook each Friday. Looking back now, I realize how carefully constructed it all was. The stories were too detailed, too consistent. The gifts were too thoughtful, as if chosen to reinforce a narrative rather than bought spontaneously. Even his exhaustion seemed performed, dramatic enough to discourage questions about his week, but not so severe that I'd worry about his health. But I trusted him completely. When you love someone, when you build a life together, trust becomes as natural as breathing. You don't interrogate every story or demand proof of every business dinner. Now, holding these wedding photos, I can't stop wondering when the lies began. Was he already planning this deception when he slipped the ring on my finger? The Greg in these photos looks like a stranger now. His smile seems calculated, his eyes holding secrets I was too in love to notice. The funeral was a blur of condolences and casseroles, but now the house feels impossibly quiet. I've been avoiding Greg's home office for days, but I can't put it off any longer. If I'm going to understand what happened, I need to start somewhere. His office looks exactly as he left it. Coffee mug still on the desk, half filled with something that's now growing mold. His laptop is closed but plugged in, the charging light blinking steadily. Everything appears normal, which somehow makes it worse. I start with his desk drawers, feeling like I'm violating something sacred. The top drawer contains the usual suspects: pens, paper clips, sticky notes. But underneath a stack of blank notepads, my fingers find something unexpected: receipts. Lots of them. These aren't the business dinner receipts I'd expect. There's a receipt from a storage unit rental facility dated 4 months ago. Another from a copy shop for document reproduction services, totaling $347. A third from an electronics store for something called a digital voice recorder. Why would Greg need a storage unit? What documents was he copying? And what was he recording? I pull out more receipts, spreading them across his desk like pieces of a puzzle I don't understand. Gas stations in towns I've never heard of. Restaurants in cities where he never mentioned having meetings. A hotel bill from St. Louis, except Greg told me he was in Seattle that week. My hands are shaking as I continue searching. In the bottom drawer, behind a stack of old tax returns, I find business cards. Not Greg's business cards, these belong to other people. A private investigator named Jack Chen. A lawyer specializing in whistleblower protection. Someone from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Each card sends a chill through me. Why would my husband, a financial analyst, need to contact these kinds of people? What kind of trouble was he in? I flip through the cards again, looking for clues. The private investigator's card has a handwritten note on the back: Tuesday 3 p.m. Bring photos. The lawyer's card has a phone number circled in red ink. The FBI agent's card looks worn, as if it had been handled frequently. There's a pattern here, but I can't see it clearly yet. Greg wasn't just living a double life, he was investigating something. But what? And why couldn't he tell me? I turn on his computer, hoping to find more answers, but it requires a password. I try our anniversary, his birthday, my birthday, our dog's name from childhood. Nothing works. Greg was always security conscious, but this feels different. This feels like he was protecting secrets. The phone rings, making me jump. It's my sister calling to check on me, but I can barely concentrate on our conversation. My mind keeps returning to those business cards, those unexplained receipts. After I hang up, I sit in Greg's chair, surrounded by evidence of a life I knew nothing about. The storage unit receipt lists an address across town. Whatever Greg was hiding, some of it might be there. The private investigator's card suggests he was working with someone, sharing information. The FBI contact means this was serious, potentially criminal. I think about the Greg I married, the man who couldn't lie about liking my cooking when it was terrible, who felt guilty about jaywalking. How did that person become someone who maintained elaborate deceptions and secret investigations? But maybe that's exactly why he was doing this. Maybe the Greg I knew, honest, principled, unable to ignore injustice, discovered something he couldn't walk away from. Maybe the lies weren't about betraying me, but about protecting me from something dangerous. I gather the receipts and business cards, creating a small pile of evidence. Tomorrow, I'll start making phone calls. I'll visit that storage unit. I'll begin following the trail Greg left behind, whether he meant to or not, whatever he was involved in. Whatever got him killed, because I'm becoming more certain that's what happened. I'm going to find out. I owe him that much. I owe myself that much. The man I married wouldn't have lived these lies without a compelling reason, and I'm going to discover what that reason was. The next morning, I'm sitting across from Janet Morrison, our longtime financial advisor at First National. I've brought Greg's receipts and business cards, hoping she can help me make sense of our finances. What she tells me makes everything more confusing. I'm sorry, Sophia, but there seems to be some confusion, Janet says, adjusting her glasses as she reviews her computer screen. Greg opened a separate business account 6 months ago. We sent the statements to a P.O. box address he provided. My stomach drops. What kind of business account? It's listed under G. Morrison Consulting Services. There have been regular deposits, substantial ones. The most recent balance shows just over $47,000. $47,000. In an account I knew nothing about. From a business that doesn't exist, at least, not that I knew about. Can you show me the deposit history? I ask, trying to keep my voice steady. Janet hesitates. Normally I would need proper authorization, but given the circumstances and your joint power of attorney. She turns her screen toward me. The deposits come in every 2 weeks, always the same amount, $3,000. The source is listed as Meridian Financial Group. But that's where he worked, I say, confused. Why would they be paying him through a separate business account? That's what I found odd too. We also handle Meridian's corporate accounts, and I've never seen this type of arrangement. Usually, consultant payments go through their standard vendor system. I stare at the screen, watching months of mysterious deposits scroll past. Each one represents 2 weeks of Greg's secret life, 2 weeks of lies about where he was and what he was doing. Janet, is there any way to trace where these payments originated within Meridian? She clicks through several screens. The transfers show an internal code I don't recognize. It's not from their payroll system or their standard consulting budget. This looks more like discretionary funding. What does that mean? It could be payments for special projects, confidential work, or... She pauses, looking uncomfortable. Sometimes companies use discretionary accounts for activities they don't want in their regular books. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Greg wasn't just consulting for Meridian, he was being paid for something they wanted to keep off the official records. Something worth $3,000 every 2 weeks. There's something else, Janet continues, pulling up another screen. The account has automatic transfers set up. Every month, exactly $2,000 goes to a law firm called Henderson and Associates. Another $500 goes to something called Secure Store Solutions. Henderson and Associates, I remember that name from one of the business cards in Greg's desk. And Secure Store must be the storage facility from the receipt. Janet, I need copies of everything. All the statements, all the transaction records, everything you can legally provide. As she prints the documents, my mind races. Greg was receiving payments from Meridian for work they wanted kept secret. He was paying a lawyer monthly, the same lawyer whose card was in his desk. And he was paying for storage, presumably for whatever evidence he was collecting. This wasn't an affair. This wasn't even a simple case of financial deception. Greg was involved in something that required legal protection and secure document storage. Something worth $47,000 in 6 months. Sophia, Janet says quietly, handing me the stack of papers. I've been in banking for 23 years. This pattern, regular payments, legal fees, secure storage, it looks like someone building a case. A big one. A case against whom? I can't say for certain, but given that Meridian is paying him while he's supposedly no longer employed there. She doesn't finish the sentence, but she doesn't need to. Greg was building a case against his own company. The travel, the secretive behavior, the fake resignation, it was all part of an investigation into Meridian Financial. And if they discovered what he was doing, if they realized he was gathering evidence against them, I fold the bank statements carefully and slip them into my purse. $47,000 represents more than money, it represents months of dangerous work that Greg couldn't tell me about. Work that may have gotten him killed. As I leave the bank, I realize I'm not just grieving a husband anymore. I'm uncovering a whistleblower, and if Greg's investigation was as serious as these numbers suggest, then I might be in danger too. But I can't stop now. Greg died for whatever truth he was pursuing, and I'm going to make sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain. The next stop is Henderson and Associates. It's time to find out what Greg was paying them to do. Henderson and Associates occupies the entire 15th floor of a downtown high-rise. The receptionist's expression shifts when I mention Greg's name, not surprise, but recognition tinged with something that looks like sympathy. Mrs. Morrison? I'm so sorry for your loss. Mr. Henderson has been expecting you might call. She speaks quietly, as if we're sharing secrets. Let me see if he's available. Within minutes, I'm sitting across from Thomas Henderson, a man in his 60s with kind eyes and the careful demeanor of someone who handles dangerous secrets professionally. His office walls are lined with legal texts and what appear to be industry awards for whistleblower advocacy. Your husband was a brave man, he begins without preamble. What he was doing required tremendous courage. What exactly was he doing? I've discovered bank accounts I never knew about, payments from his former employer, and now I find out he was paying you monthly retainer fees. Henderson opens a thick file folder labeled Morrison, Gregory, Confidential. Inside, I can see photocopied documents, printed emails, and what appear to be financial spreadsheets. 6 months ago, Greg came to me with evidence of massive fraud at Meridian Financial. They were manipulating client investment portfolios, skimming fees, and using client funds for unauthorized high-risk investments. We're talking about stealing from pension funds, retirement accounts, college savings, ordinary people's life savings. The room seems to spin slightly. How much money? Conservative estimate? $37 million over the past 4 years. But Greg believed the actual amount was much higher. I think about our comfortable life, the renovated kitchen, the weekend getaways. All funded by Greg's salary from a company that was stealing millions from their clients. Why didn't he go to the authorities immediately? Henderson leans forward. He tried. Greg filed a complaint with the SEC 8 months ago. Nothing happened. That's when he came to me. We realized he needed to gather more evidence, irrefutable proof that would force action. So he pretended to quit? It was the only way. Meridian was getting suspicious about his questions, his access to certain files. We created a cover story. He would appear to quit but continue working as a paid consultant, giving him reason to access their systems while building his case. The business registration documents I'd found suddenly make sense. Greg hadn't just pretended to quit, he'd actually started a consulting company to provide legal cover for his investigation. The $3,000 payments? Compensation for his work, but also insurance. If anything happened to him, the money would provide for you while we completed the case. Greg was very concerned about your financial security. Even while living a double life, Greg was protecting me. The thought brings tears I wasn't expecting. Henderson continues. We were close to filing a formal complaint with the FBI. Greg had documented systematic fraud, identified the key players, and traced the money flows. He was scheduled to meet with federal investigators next week. Next week? The timing feels cruel. Do you think Meridian found out what he was doing? I can't prove it, but Greg called me 2 days before he died. He was concerned that someone at the company had become suspicious. He mentioned feeling like he was being watched. My blood runs cold. Did you advise him to stop? I told him to be careful, but Greg was determined to see this through. He kept saying that thousands of people were being robbed and no one else was going to stop it. Henderson slides a business card across his desk. This is Agent Patricia Williams with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Greg was supposed to meet with her Monday. She's been trying to reach you. Agent Williams, another card from Greg's desk collection. He was so close to exposing everything. What happens now? That depends on you. Greg's evidence is solid, but having someone who can testify about his character, his motivations, his concern for the victims, that would strengthen the case considerably. Are you asking me to continue what Greg started? I'm asking you to consider it. Greg died trying to protect innocent people from having their futures stolen. His work doesn't have to die with him. I look at the thick file, imagining months of Greg's secret life condensed into legal documents and evidence. All those business trips, all those carefully constructed lies, they were for this. To build a case that could recover millions of dollars for victims who didn't even know they were being robbed. What would I need to do? Help us understand Greg's methods, his timeline, his concerns. Meet with Agent Williams. And most importantly, be prepared for Meridian to fight back. If they killed Greg to stop this investigation, they won't hesitate to discredit you. The word killed hangs in the air between us. We both know Greg's death wasn't natural, even if we can't prove it yet. Mr. Henderson, I need to ask you something directly. Do you believe my husband was murdered? He's quiet for a long moment. I believe your husband posed a $37 million threat to some very powerful people. I believe he was scheduled to meet with federal investigators in 5 days. And I believe that timing is not coincidental. I take Agent Williams's card and slip it into my purse next to the bank statements. Greg's investigation isn't over, it's just beginning. And now it's my responsibility to see it through. The flight to Chicago feels surreal. 2 weeks ago, I thought Greg was here for client meetings. Now I know he was here to die, though I still don't understand exactly how or why. The Palmer House Hotel is elegant in that old money way that Greg always loved. The lobby bustles with business travelers and tourists, everyone going somewhere with purpose. I approach the front desk with Greg's photo and his real name, hoping someone remembers him. "Oh yes, Mr. Morrison," the desk clerk says. Immediately. Such a tragedy. He was one of our regular guests. Regular guests. How regular? He stayed with us twice a month for the past 6 months. Always requested the same room, 1247. Always paid in cash, which was unusual for business travelers. Cash. Payments. Another detail that doesn't fit the corporate expense account story Greg had told me. I'm his widow. I was hoping to understand more about his last visit. Did he seem different? Was he meeting with anyone? The clerk glances around nervously. "Ma'am, I probably shouldn't be discussing guest details, but, given what happened, and because your family..." She lowers her voice. Mr. Morrison seemed very stressed his last few visits. He asked several times about our security cameras, whether they covered the elevators and hallways. Did he say why? He mentioned feeling like someone might be following him. We offered to contact hotel security, but he declined. Someone was following him. Greg's paranoia wasn't paranoia at all, it was justified caution that unfortunately wasn't enough. Was he meeting with people here? Sometimes. Usually in the lobby bar or the business center. Professional-looking people with briefcases. I assumed they were clients. She directs me to Marcus, the night security supervisor, who remembers Greg well. We review security footage from Greg's final visit, and what I see chills me to the bone. The timestamp shows Greg entering the hotel at 6:23 p.m. on his last night alive. He looks nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder. At 7:15 p.m., he meets with a woman in the lobby bar, mid-40s, dark hair, carrying a leather portfolio. They talk intensely for about 20 minutes. "Do you know who she is?" I ask Marcus. "Never. Seen her before that night. But look at this." He fast-forwards the footage. At 11:30 p.m., 2 men in expensive suits enter the hotel. They don't check in, don't speak to the front desk. Instead, they go directly to the elevators. Can you track them to Greg's floor? Marcus switches camera angles. The men exit on the 12th floor at 11:34 p.m. The hallway camera shows them walking purposefully toward room 1247. Then, strangely, the camera feed cuts out. What happened to the video? Technical malfunction, according to our maintenance logs. The cameras on the 12th floor were offline from 11:35 p.m. until 2:17 a.m. The timing is too convenient to be coincidental. Someone with technical knowledge disabled the security system during the exact window when Greg died. Marcus, in your professional opinion, was this planned? He's quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. In 15 years of hotel security, I've never seen a camera malfunction that precise. And I've never seen 2 men in suits visit a guest at midnight who didn't want those men to visit. We review more footage. The 2 men leave at 2:10 a.m., just 7 minutes before the cameras mysteriously start working again. They move calmly, carrying nothing, looking like businessmen concluding a successful meeting. Did anyone check on Greg that night? Housekeeping found him the next morning. Heart attack, according to the medical examiner. But Marcus hesitates. But what? Room service delivered a bottle of wine to his room at 11:40 p.m. Wine he didn't order. The delivery person wasn't one of our regular staff, someone called in sick and we used a temporary worker. We don't have records of who sent the wine or who the replacement worker was. Poisoned wine delivered by a fake room service worker while the security cameras were mysteriously offline. This wasn't a heart attack, it was an execution made to look like natural causes. Marcus, I need copies of whatever footage you can legally provide. My husband was investigating corporate fraud, and I believe he was murdered to stop him. Ma'am, I can't officially provide footage without a warrant, but he writes something on a piece of paper. This is the name of a PI I sometimes work with. Former cop, very discreet. If someone wanted to preserve evidence before it mysteriously disappeared, she'd be the person to call. I take the paper gratefully. Another piece of Greg's investigation, another connection in a web that's becoming clearer and more dangerous. Before leaving Chicago, I visit room 1247. The hotel has cleaned it, of course, but standing where Greg spent his final hours, I feel closer to understanding what happened. He came here to meet with someone, the woman in the lobby bar. She gave him information, or he gave her evidence. Then, later that night, two professionals came to silence him permanently. Greg wasn't just investigating Meridian's fraud, he was close enough to exposing it that they decided he had to die. The question now is whether they know I'm continuing his work, and how far they'll go to stop me too. Back home, I can't stop thinking about the woman in the hotel security footage. Dark hair, professional attire, intense conversation with Greg just hours before he died. My imagination creates stories I don't want to believe, secret affairs. Romantic betrayals layered on top of financial ones. That's when I decide to search Greg's belongings more thoroughly. In his dresser, behind a stack of old t-shirts, I find something that stops my heart: letters. Not emails or texts, but actual handwritten letters on expensive stationery. My hands shake as I open the first one, expecting to find evidence of infidelity that will shatter what's left of my faith in our marriage. Instead, I find something completely different. Greg, the first letter begins, "I can't thank you enough for what you're doing. My mother's entire retirement fund was invested through Meridian, everything she saved from 40 years of teaching. When I discovered they'd lost almost half of it in unauthorized trades, I felt so helpless. Knowing that someone with inside access is fighting for victims like her gives me hope for the first time in months." It's signed Julia Chen, with a phone number and address in Detroit. The second letter is similar. "Greg, the documents you provided helped my lawyer understand exactly how Meridian manipulated my father's pension fund. Dad worked construction for 35 years, trusting them to keep his money safe. What they did to him, to all of us, is criminal. Thank you for caring about people you've never met." This one is signed Maria Santos. There are 12 letters. In total, each from a different person, each telling a similar story. Retirement funds decimated. College savings vanished. Pension investments manipulated. And all of them thanking Greg for helping them understand what happened to their money. Greg wasn't having an affair, he was corresponding with Meridian's victims. People who had lost everything but didn't understand how or why until Greg reached out to them with evidence and explanations. The letters paint a picture of my husband that breaks my heart in an entirely different way. While I thought he was traveling for business, he was actually traveling to meet with elderly retirees and working families whose futures had been stolen. He was documenting their stories, gathering their statements, building a human face to put on Meridian's crimes. One letter mentions Greg visiting in person. "It meant so much to have you come to Portland to explain what happened to Mom's account. She's 87 and doesn't understand financial terms, but when you sat at her kitchen table and showed her exactly how they took her money, she finally felt like someone cared." Another describes Greg helping a victim contact lawyers. "The attorney you recommended has agreed to represent our class action suit. Without your evidence about Meridian's systematic fraud, we never would have had a case. These weren't business trips, they were rescue missions." Greg was using his own money to travel across the country, meeting with victims, helping them understand their losses, connecting them with legal resources. The man I married, the one who couldn't ignore injustice, had found the biggest injustice of his career and dedicated his life to fighting it. The 12th letter is different. It's from someone named Jennifer Walsh in Chicago, dated just 3 days before Greg died. "Greg, I finished compiling the additional evidence you requested. The internal emails I copied before leaving Meridian clearly show the executives knew about the unauthorized trading. They called it optimizing client returns in meetings, but the private communications prove they knew they were stealing. I'll have everything ready when we meet Monday night. Jennifer Walsh." The woman in the hotel security footage. Not a romantic rival, but another whistleblower, someone who had worked inside Meridian and escaped with evidence. I find her phone number written on the back of the letter and dial before I can lose my nerve. Hello? The voice matches the woman I saw in the hotel video. Ms. Walsh? This is Sophia Morrison. Greg Morrison's wife. There's a long pause. Oh God. I heard about what happened. I'm so sorry. I know you met with Greg the night he died. I need to understand what you discussed. Mrs. Morrison, I don't think we should talk over the phone. If you're willing to meet in person, I have things you need to know. Things about what really happened to your husband. We arranged to meet the next day at a coffee shop downtown. As I hang up, I realize Greg's final business trip wasn't about consulting or client meetings. He was collecting the last pieces of evidence needed to destroy Meridian Financial, meeting with a fellow whistleblower who had risked her own career to help him. The letters spread across my bed tell the real story of Greg's secret life. Every fake business trip was actually a mission to help fraud victims. Every mysterious receipt was related to building a case for justice. My husband didn't die having an affair, he died trying to save the life savings of people he'd never met. Reading these letters, I finally understand the man I married. Greg couldn't walk away from suffering when he had the power to stop it. And now, holding the evidence of his sacrifice, I know I can't walk away either. Jennifer Walsh looks exactly like the woman from the hotel security footage, but in person she seems smaller, more fragile. We meet at a busy downtown coffee shop where conversations can blend into background noise. She's chosen a corner table. With clear views of both entrances, someone who's learned to be cautious, she slides a small device across the table, a smartphone I've never seen before. This was Greg's, she says quietly. He gave it to me that night, told me to keep it safe and give it to you if anything happened to him. The phone is password protected, but when I enter our anniversary date, it unlocks immediately. Greg knew I would figure it out. What's on here? Everything. Photos of internal documents, recorded conversations, financial records, correspondence with victims. Greg was meticulous about documenting every piece of evidence. I scroll through the phone, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information. Hundreds of photos showing Meridian's internal emails, spreadsheets detailing unauthorized trades, audio files of executive meetings where they discussed maximizing fee extraction from client accounts. Jennifer, how do you know all this? How did you meet Greg? She takes a shaky sip of her coffee. I worked at Meridian for 6 years. Compliance department. My job was supposed to be preventing exactly what they were doing, but every time I raised concerns, I was told to focus on bigger picture issues. It took me too long to realize the fraud wasn't happening despite compliance, it was happening with compliance's knowledge. When did you first contact Greg? I didn't. He contacted me. About 8 months ago, he started asking questions about specific trades, client accounts that didn't match their paperwork. I tried to deflect, but Greg was persistent. Finally, I realized he wasn't trying to cover anything up, he was trying to expose it. The coffee shop suddenly feels too public, too exposed. I lean closer. What did you tell him? At first, just hints. I'd mention which executives to look into, which accounts showed the biggest discrepancies. But as Greg gathered more evidence, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. People were losing their life savings while I processed compliance reports and pretended not to see the obvious fraud. She shows me photos on her own phone, screenshots of internal emails, photos of printed documents taken secretly in Meridian's offices. This one shows the executives discussing how to hide losses from the Patterson Pension Fund, she explains, pointing to an email chain. And this one details their plan to blame market volatility for losses they caused through unauthorized day trading. The casual cruelty in the emails is breathtaking. These executives are discussing the destruction of people's retirement dreams. Like they're talking about weekend golf plans. Jennifer, why did you finally decide to help Greg? My grandmother. Her voice breaks slightly. She had her retirement account with Meridian. When I realized they'd lost 60% of her savings through unauthorized trading, I couldn't pretend anymore. I started copying everything I could find. Is that what you gave Greg the night he died? The final piece of the puzzle. Internal communications proving the executives knew about the fraud from the beginning. Not just the trading violations, but the systematic cover-up. Names, dates, dollar amounts, everything needed for criminal prosecution. I look at Greg's phone, realizing I'm holding evidence that cost my husband his life. Do you think they killed him? I know they did. She glances around nervously. Greg called me 2 hours before we met. He said someone had been following him, that his hotel room had been searched while he was out. He was scared, but he was determined to complete the handoff. Why didn't you go to the police immediately? With what proof? A heart attack in a hotel room looks natural. The security camera malfunction could be explained as coincidence. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to keep Greg's evidence safe. She pulls out a business card, Agent Patricia Williams, FBI Financial Crimes Division. I've been in contact with Agent Williams since Greg died. She's ready to move forward with the investigation, but she needs someone who can testify about Greg's character and motivations. Someone who can explain why he risked everything to expose this fraud. Me. You're the only one who can speak to who Greg really was, why he cared so much about people he'd never met. Without that human element, this becomes just another white-collar crime case. With your testimony, it becomes a story about justice. I think about the letters from victims, the months of secret travel, the careful documentation of every crime. Greg didn't just uncover fraud, he built a case so thorough that Meridian's executives would have no choice but to face consequences. Jennifer, are you still in danger? We both are. If they killed Greg to stop this investigation, they'll kill us too if they discover we're continuing his work. That's why I've been careful, why I waited 2 weeks to contact you. She slides another piece of paper across the table, an address I don't recognize. This is a safe house Agent Williams arranged. If you decide to move forward with Greg's investigation, if you're willing to testify against Meridian, you should consider staying there until the arrests are made. Looking at Greg's phone, at the evidence he died to preserve, I realize I'm not just deciding whether to seek justice for my husband. I'm deciding whether to complete a mission that could recover millions of dollars for fraud victims, ensure that criminals face consequences, and honor the sacrifice Greg made. When do we meet with Agent Williams? Jennifer smiles for the first time since we sat down. Tomorrow morning. Greg would be proud of you. As we leave the coffee shop separately, I clutch Greg's phone tightly. Whatever happens next, I'm no longer just a widow trying to understand her husband's death. I'm a whistleblower carrying forward a fight for justice. Agent Patricia Williams looks exactly like someone who investigates financial crimes for a living, sharp, methodical, and completely unimpressed by corporate power. Her office in the federal building is sparse but organized, with white boards covered in what appear to be organizational charts and financial flow diagrams. Mrs. Morrison, I've been investigating Meridian Financial for 18 months, she begins without preamble. Your husband provided evidence that transformed our investigation from routine regulatory review to criminal prosecution. She opens a thick folder labeled Operation Clean Sweep and spreads documents across the conference table. Corporate organizational charts, bank routing records, and what appear to be surveillance photos of Meridian executives. The scope of the fraud is larger than we initially realized. Meridian wasn't just stealing from individual clients, they were running a systematic operation that diverted funds from pension accounts, retirement portfolios, and college savings plans into high-risk trading schemes. How much money are we talking about? I ask, though I'm not sure I want to know. Conservative estimate, $63 million over 5 years. But Greg's evidence suggests the actual amount could exceed $90 million. $90 million. The number is so large it almost seems abstract, until I think about the letters from victims, real people who lost their life savings to finance these crimes. Agent Williams continues, the executives weren't just stealing money. They were using sophisticated accounting tricks to hide the losses, forging client signatures on authorization forms, and bribing auditors to overlook discrepancies. She shows me a document that makes my stomach turn, a forged signature authorization for a $127,000 withdrawal from an elderly woman's retirement account. This is Margaret Peterson, age 84. Meridian stole her entire retirement fund to cover losses from unauthorized day trading. When she questioned the withdrawal, they told her she had authorized it for portfolio optimization. What happened to her? She's living with her daughter now, completely dependent on Social Security. Her life savings, gone. The cruelty is breathtaking. These weren't victimless financial crimes, they were systematic theft from vulnerable people who trusted Meridian with their futures. Agent Williams, how did Greg get involved in this? He stumbled onto it accidentally. As a senior analyst, he had access to client portfolios for legitimate review purposes. He started noticing patterns, accounts that showed authorization for trades the clients never approved, fees that exceeded what contracts specified, returns that didn't match market performance. She pulls out another document, a timeline Greg had created showing the progression of his investigation. Initially, Greg thought he was seeing isolated mistakes. But as he dug deeper, he realized he was looking at systematic fraud involving the highest levels of management. That's when he contacted our office. Why didn't you just arrest them immediately? Financial fraud cases require overwhelming evidence. We needed proof of intent, documentation of the systematic nature of the crimes, and evidence that connected the fraud to specific individuals. Greg was uniquely positioned to gather that evidence from inside the company. Agent Williams shows me surveillance photos, Meridian executives meeting in expensive restaurants, private clubs, and what appear to be offshore banking locations. These executives were sophisticated criminals. They used shell companies, offshore accounts, and encrypted communications to coordinate their activities. Breaking their operation required someone with inside access who could document their methods. So Greg became an undercover investigator? Essentially, yes. We couldn't legally ask him to gather evidence covertly, but when he offered to continue his investigation as a paid consultant, we provided guidance on what types of evidence would be most useful for prosecution. The fake resignation, the business account, the secret meetings, it all makes sense now. Greg wasn't just gathering evidence, he was building a federal case with FBI guidance. Agent Williams, do you believe Greg was murdered? She's quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. I believe Greg posed an existential threat to people who had stolen nearly $100 million. I believe he was scheduled to provide testimony that would send multiple executives to federal prison. And I believe the timing of his death was not coincidental. Can you prove it? Not yet. But we're investigating. The hotel security camera malfunction, the mysterious room service delivery, the presence of unknown individuals on Greg's floor, we're treating this as a potential homicide. She opens another folder, this one containing medical examiner reports and toxicology results. Greg's blood work showed traces of a compound that can cause cardiac arrest in small doses. It's not a substance that occurs naturally, and it's not something available over the counter. He was poisoned? We believe so. The compound was delivered in a way that would cause symptoms resembling a heart attack within hours of consumption. The wine delivery to his room is our primary suspect for the vector. The clinical description can't capture the horror of what they're describing, Greg, alone in a hotel room, trusting a wine delivery that was actually his execution. What happens now? We move forward with the prosecution using Greg's evidence. Jennifer Walsh has agreed to testify about the internal cover-up. And we'd like you to testify about Greg's character, his motivations, and his commitment to protecting fraud victims. Will I be safe? Agent Williams looks me directly in the eye. I won't lie to you, if they killed Greg to protect themselves, they might target you too. But we can provide protection, and once we make arrests, the immediate danger should diminish significantly. When will the arrests happen? Within the next 2 weeks. We're coordinating with federal prosecutors to ensure all charges are filed simultaneously. Greg's evidence allows us to pursue RICO charges, treating Meridian's fraud operation as organized crime. I think about the letters from victims, the months Greg spent away from home, the careful way he balanced protecting me from danger while building a case for justice. Agent Williams, I want to testify. Greg died for this investigation, and I'm going to make sure his sacrifice leads to convictions. I hoped you'd say that. She hands me a card with an address. This is a safe house. I recommend you stay there until after the arrests. And Mrs. Morrison? Your husband was a hero. What he did will help recover millions of dollars for fraud victims and ensure these criminals face justice. As I leave the federal building, I realize Greg's death wasn't the end of his investigation, it was the beginning of justice. The threatening message arrives the next morning, slipped under my front door while I slept. No envelope, just a single sheet of paper with words that make my blood run cold. Your husband should have minded his own business. Don't make his mistake. I call Agent Williams immediately, my hands shaking as I dial. We're moving you to the safe house today, she says after I read her the message. This confirms they know you're continuing Greg's investigation. While I pack a bag, I can't stop thinking about how they found me, how they knew I was involved. Then I remember Jennifer's warning about being watched, about Greg's paranoia in his final weeks. They've probably been monitoring me since the funeral. Agent Williams arrives with 2 other agents, both armed and alert. As we drive to the safe house, she shows me more evidence that explains why Meridian is so desperate to stop the investigation. We found these in Greg's hotel room safe, she says, handing me a folder of printed emails. They're communications between Meridian executives from the week before Greg died. The first email is from CEO Richard Blackwood to CFO Marcus Sterling. The Morrison problem needs permanent resolution. He has enough evidence to destroy us all. The second is Sterling's response. Chicago contact confirms solution will appear. Natural. Timeline, 48 hours. Chicago contact. Professional killers hired to eliminate the threat Greg represented. They planned his murder, I say, stating the obvious because the reality is still hard to accept. These emails will be key evidence in the murder charges. But they also explain why you're in danger. If they're willing to kill Greg to protect their fraud scheme, they won't hesitate to kill you. The safe house is a modest apartment in a nondescript complex across town. 2 FBI agents will maintain 24-hour surveillance while I'm here. It feels surreal, hiding from corporate executives who order murders like they order lunch. Agent Williams shows me more evidence Greg had collected, including recordings he made using a voice recorder concealed in his briefcase. I hear Meridian executives discussing their crimes with casual indifference. The Patterson pension fund is down another $2 million, one voice says. Should we notify them? Why create unnecessary alarm? Another responds. Market volatility explains everything. Our clients trust us to manage their funds appropriately. Except, managing appropriately meant stealing millions while lying about the causes of losses. Greg recorded over 40 hours of these conversations, Agent Williams explains. Executive meetings, phone calls, private discussions where they openly admitted to fraud and discussed covering it up. One recording is particularly damning, CFO Sterling explaining to other executives how they would blame Greg if their crimes were exposed. Morrison had legitimate access to those accounts. If investigators come asking questions, we say he went rogue, made unauthorized trades, and we discovered his crimes after he conveniently died. They weren't just planning to kill Greg, they were planning to frame him posthumously for their crimes. Is that why they wanted it to look like a heart attack? I ask. Exactly. If Greg died naturally, they could claim he confessed to fraud before his death and was overcome by guilt. Dead men can't defend themselves. I think about our life together, about Greg's integrity and moral compass. The idea of him being remembered as a criminal instead of a hero makes me furious. Agent Williams, how could I help ensure they don't succeed in framing him? Your testimony will be crucial. You can speak to Greg's character, his motivation for helping fraud victims, his cooperation with our investigation. A jury needs to understand that Greg was a whistleblower, not a criminal. She shows me one final piece of evidence, a letter Greg wrote but never sent, found in his hotel room after his death. My dearest Sophia, it begins, if you're reading this, something has happened to me, and I need you to understand why I couldn't tell you the truth about what I was doing. The letter explains everything, his discovery of the fraud, his decision to work with the FBI, his fear that involving me would put me in danger. I know the lies about business trips hurt you, he wrote. I know you wondered if I was having an affair or if our marriage was failing. The truth is that I was falling in love with you more deeply every day, and that love made me determined to fight injustice wherever I found it. I couldn't live with myself knowing that innocent people were being robbed while I stayed silent. The letter continues, if something happens to me, please know that every secret I kept was to protect you. But if you're strong enough, if you're willing to risk the danger, please help finish what I started. These criminals destroyed the futures of hundreds of families. They deserve to face justice. Reading Greg's final words, I realized that his secret life wasn't a betrayal of our marriage, it was an expression of the values that made me fall in love with him in the first place. Agent Williams, when do we make the arrests? Tomorrow morning. Coordinated raids on executive homes and offices, search warrants for all financial records, and arrests on charges ranging from fraud to racketeering to conspiracy to commit murder. What do you need from me? Be ready to testify. Greg's evidence will convict them, but your testimony will ensure they understand the human cost of their crimes. Both the cost to fraud victims and the cost to you, a woman who lost her husband because he couldn't ignore injustice. As I settle into the safe house for my final night before the arrests, I read Greg's letter again. Tomorrow, his investigation will finally result in justice. The men who ordered his death will face federal charges. The fraud victims will have a chance at recovering their stolen money. Greg died protecting a truth that was too dangerous for criminals to allow. But their threats and violence couldn't stop that truth from emerging. Tomorrow, justice begins. The arrests happen exactly as Agent Williams promised. At 6 a.m., coordinated FBI raids target Meridian Financial's headquarters and the homes of key executives. I watch the news coverage from the safe house, seeing handcuffed men in expensive suits being led away from suburban mansions. CEO Richard Blackwood tries to hide his face from cameras as agents escort him from his $3.2 million home. CFO Marcus Sterling is arrested at his country club, still wearing golf attire. The local news describes it as the largest financial fraud bust in the city's history. Agent Williams calls me as the arrests unfold. We've seized over 40 computers, hundreds of documents, and multiple encrypted phones. Greg's evidence led us to additional crimes we hadn't even discovered yet. What kinds of additional crimes? Money laundering through offshore accounts, tax evasion, bribing banking regulators, and evidence of other murders. Greg wasn't their first victim, just their most recent. The scope of Meridian's criminal enterprise is staggering. What began as investment fraud had evolved into a full criminal organization with international connections and a willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operations. Agent Williams, you mentioned other murders? A former Meridian compliance officer named Thomas Reed died in a car accident 2 years ago. His brake lines had been cut. An investigative journalist named Angela Foster, who was researching Meridian's practices, died in an apparent suicide last year. We found evidence suggesting both were murdered. Greg wasn't alone in trying to expose these crimes, and he wasn't alone in paying the ultimate price for his courage, the FBI contact card that started. This all seems almost quaint now compared to the federal task force that's emerged. Agent Williams introduces me to prosecutors, forensic accountants, and international investigators who are tracing Meridian's money through banks in 7 countries. Mrs. Morrison, your husband uncovered what may be the largest organized financial crime operation in recent history, says federal prosecutor Janet Kim. His evidence is leading us to criminal networks across multiple states and several foreign countries. Over the following days, more details emerge. Meridian executives used their stolen money to purchase luxury properties, finance other criminal enterprises, and bribe officials to ignore their activities. The $3,000 payments to Greg weren't just compensation, they were a fraction of what they were stealing from victims every single day. Jennifer Walsh provides additional testimony about the internal cover-up. They had code words for their criminal activities, she explains during a deposition I'm allowed to observe. Unauthorized trading was called portfolio optimization. Stealing from accounts was liquidity management. They had an entire vocabulary designed to disguise their crimes. The evidence room at FBI headquarters contains boxes of documents Greg collected over 6 months of investigation. Financial records, recorded conversations, victim testimonies, and proof of systematic fraud that totaled nearly $100 million. Greg documented everything, Agent Williams tells me as we review the evidence. Every crime, every victim, every method they used to steal and cover up their theft. This case will be studied in law schools as an example of how persistent investigation can expose seemingly untouchable criminals. But the personal cost weighs heavily on everyone involved. Besides Greg, Thomas Reed, and Angela Foster, investigators discover that Meridian targeted at least 4 other people who asked too many questions. A bank examiner who died in a suspicious drowning. A SEC investigator who suffered a fatal heart attack after receiving death threats. A fraud victim's son who was killed in what appeared to be a random mugging. They killed anyone who got close to the truth, Agent Williams explains. Greg knew he was in danger, but he also knew he was the only person positioned to gather the evidence needed for prosecution. The FBI shows me Greg's final recorded conversation, made just hours before his death. He's speaking to Jennifer Walsh, but he knows I might someday hear these words. If something happens to me, Greg's voice says, make sure Sophia knows that everything I did was to protect innocent people from these criminals. I couldn't tell her because involving her would have put her in danger. But I need her to know that every lie I told was in service of a greater truth. His voice continues, these executives sleep in mansions built with money stolen from teachers' retirement funds and factory workers' pensions. They send their children to elite schools, using college savings they stole from other families. Someone has to stop them, even if it costs everything. Listening to Greg's final recording, I understand that his secret life wasn't about betraying our marriage, it was about honoring the values that brought us together. He couldn't live with injustice when he had the power to fight it. Agent Williams, when do I testify? Next week. The grand jury will hear evidence for criminal indictments, and your testimony about Greg's character and motivations will be crucial for the murder charges. As I prepare for testimony, I realize that Greg's death wasn't the end of his fight against Meridian's crimes, it was the beginning of justice for all their victims. The evidence he died to preserve will ensure that these criminals face consequences. And that fraud victims have a chance to recover their stolen futures. Tomorrow, I'll tell Greg's story to a grand jury. His investigation will finally result in the justice he died trying to achieve. The grand jury testimony goes better than I hoped. 12 citizens listen as I explain who Greg really was, not a rogue employee who stole from clients, but a whistleblower who died protecting innocent victims from corporate criminals. But the real confrontation comes later that week, in an unexpected setting. I'm leaving the federal courthouse after another meeting with prosecutors when a black sedan pulls up beside me. The window rolls down, revealing Marcus Sterling, Meridian's former CFO. He's out on bail, wearing an expensive suit that can't disguise the desperation in his eyes. Mrs. Morrison, I need to talk to you. Agent Williams had warned me about this possibility, defendants attempting to intimidate witnesses or negotiate private deals outside the legal system. Mr. Sterling, I have nothing to say to you. Please. Just 5 minutes. I have something you need to hear. Against my better judgment, I agree to meet him at a public restaurant downtown, with FBI agents positioned nearby for my safety. Sterling looks like a man whose world is collapsing. His hands shake as he orders coffee he doesn't drink, and his confident executive demeanor has been replaced by something that looks like genuine fear. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to understand something about your husband's death. I understand. Perfectly. You and your colleagues had him murdered. No. His response surprises me. I mean, yes, the murder was planned, but I wasn't part of that decision. When I found out what Blackwood and the others were planning, I tried to stop it. He pulls out a small digital recorder and places it on the table between us. This is a recording I made 3 days before Greg died. I was trying to document the conspiracy to kill him, hoping to use it as evidence if I was ever prosecuted. He presses play, and I hear voices I recognize from Greg's recordings, CEO Blackwood and 2 other executives. Morrison has enough evidence to destroy us all, Blackwood's voice says. The Chicago contact confirms they can make it look natural. Heart attack, stress-related, perfectly believable for someone his age. What about his wife, another voice asks. She doesn't know anything yet. But if she starts asking questions, she might need the same solution. Hearing them discuss murdering me so casually makes my blood run cold. Sterling stops the recording. I knew they were criminals, Mrs. Morrison, but I never thought they were killers. When I heard this conversation, I realized I was working with people who would murder anyone who threatened their profits. Why are you showing me this now? Because I'm trying to save my own life. His honesty is brutal. If I testify against Blackwood and the others, if I provide evidence about the murder conspiracy, the prosecutors might reduce my charges. I'll still go to prison, but maybe not for life. I study his face, trying to determine if this is genuine remorse or calculated self-interest. Mr. Sterling, did you help steal money from fraud victims? Yes. For 4 years, I helped orchestrate the investment fraud that stole nearly $100 million from retirement accounts and pension funds. Did you know that money belonged to teachers and factory workers and elderly people who trusted you with their life savings? Yes. And I did it anyway because the profits were enormous and the risks seemed manageable. His honesty is refreshing after months of corporate lies and cover-ups. What changed? Your husband. Sterling's voice breaks slightly. When Greg started documenting our crimes, when he began meeting with our victims, I realized what we had really done. We weren't just manipulating numbers in computer systems, we were destroying real people's futures. He shows me a printed email on his phone. This is a message Greg sent me 8 months ago. He forwarded a letter from an 87-year-old woman whose entire retirement fund we had stolen. She was asking if there was any way to recover enough money to pay for her heart medication. I read the email, recognizing Greg's careful, compassionate tone as he explained to Sterling exactly how their crimes affected real human beings. Greg made me confront what we were doing, Sterling continues. Not as abstract financial transactions, but as theft from vulnerable people who trusted us. That's when I realized I couldn't continue participating in the fraud. But you didn't stop it. I was a coward. I should have contacted the FBI like Greg did, but I was afraid of going to prison. Afraid of losing my lifestyle, afraid of facing consequences. So I just reduced my participation and hoped someone else would stop it. He pauses, looking directly at me. Mrs. Morrison, your husband was braver than all of us. He knew exposing our crimes would probably get him killed, but he did it anyway. Because he couldn't live with innocent people being robbed. Sterling hands me a USB drive. This contains every email, every document, every recorded conversation I have about Meridian's crimes. Including evidence of other murders they committed. To protect their operation. Why give this to me instead of directly to the FBI? Because I want you to decide whether my cooperation deserves any consideration. Greg died trying to get justice for fraud victims. If my evidence helps convict his killers and recover money for those victims, maybe his death will have meaning. I take the USB drive, knowing it represents another piece of the puzzle Greg died to complete. Mr. Sterling, nothing you do now will bring back my husband. But if your evidence helps convict the people who ordered his murder, if it helps fraud victims recover their stolen money, then maybe some justice can come from this tragedy. As I leave the restaurant, I realize that even Meridian's own executives couldn't ignore Greg's moral authority. His investigation didn't just expose financial crimes, it forced criminals to confront the human cost of their greed. Sterling's evidence will strengthen the prosecution's case, but more importantly, it validates Greg's belief that even the most Corrupt people can be reached by appeals to their conscience. Greg changed Marcus Sterling from an active participant in fraud to a cooperating witness against murder conspirators. Even in death, my husband continues fighting for justice. Going through Greg's childhood belongings at his mother's house, I discover photos that explain everything about his crusade against corporate fraud. In a shoebox filled with old pictures, I find documentation of his father's bankruptcy, caused by investment fraud remarkably similar to what Meridian was doing. Greg never told you about his father's business? His mother asks as we sit in her kitchen, surrounded by memories. The photos show a successful small-town contractor who lost everything when his investment advisor stole his retirement fund and business savings. Greg was 12 when his father's construction company failed, not due to poor management but because of financial fraud that went unpunished. The investment firm claimed market losses, she explains, but we later learned they had stolen money from dozens of small business owners. By the time anyone realized what happened, the executives had moved the money offshore and declared bankruptcy. Greg's father never recovered from the betrayal. He died 5 years later, broken by the loss of his life's work and the knowledge that the criminals who destroyed him faced no consequences. That's why Greg became so passionate about justice, his mother says. He watched his father suffer and die while the men who stole from him lived in mansions. Greg swore he would never let that happen to other families if he had the power to stop it. Understanding Greg's motivation makes his sacrifice even more meaningful. He wasn't just fighting abstract corporate crime, he was preventing other families from suffering what his own family had endured. The childhood photos reveal a pattern I hadn't noticed before. Even as a teenager, Greg was drawn to stories about people fighting injustice. His high school yearbook shows him as president of the Ethics Club, organizing fundraisers for families affected by corporate misconduct. He wrote his senior thesis on whistleblower protection laws, his mother tells me, pulling out a faded paper from 1998. Even then, he understood that ordinary people needed legal protection when they stood up to powerful criminals. Reading Greg's teenage writing, I see the same moral clarity that drove his investigation into Meridian. He wasn't naive about the dangers of challenging corruption, he simply believed that protecting innocent people was worth any personal risk. Mrs. Morrison, his mother says quietly, Greg called me 2 days before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure you knew about his father. He wanted you to understand that fighting these criminals wasn't just about strangers, it was about honoring his father's memory. The photos spread across the kitchen table tell the story of a family destroyed by unchecked greed, and a son who dedicated his life to ensuring other families wouldn't suffer the same fate. Greg's investigation wasn't just professional duty, it was personal mission rooted in childhood trauma and family loyalty. Looking at pictures of Greg's father, proud, hardworking, betrayed by people he trusted, I finally understand the full scope of my husband's sacrifice. He died not just protecting Meridian's victims, but completing a quest for justice that began when he was 12 years old. The subpoena documents arrive on a Tuesday morning, officially summoning me to testify in the federal trial against Meridian's executives. United States v. Blackwood encompasses charges of fraud, racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Federal prosecutor Janet Kim explains the government's strategy. We'll establish the systematic nature of the fraud first, then show how the defendants murdered anyone who threatened to expose their crimes. Your testimony connects Greg's investigation to his death. The media coverage is intense. Financial news networks describe it as the trial of the decade, while local news focuses on the human impact. Hundreds of fraud victims who lost their life savings to finance executive lifestyles. Meridian's lawyers attempt a desperate defense, claiming Greg was a rogue employee who embezzled money and fabricated evidence to cover his own crimes. They argue his death was suicide motivated by guilt over his theft. It's a predictable strategy, Kim tells me. When the evidence is overwhelming, defendants try to blame the victim. But Greg's recordings, his correspondence with fraud victims, and his cooperation with the FBI make their claims obviously false. The legal proceedings reveal the full scope of Meridian's criminal enterprise. They stole from over 400 individual accounts, bribed 3 federal regulators, laundered money through banks in 9 countries, and murdered at least 6 people who threatened their operation. Pre-trial hearings established the admissibility of Greg's evidence. Defense attorneys challenge everything: the recordings, the documents, the victim testimonies, but Judge Patricia Morrison rules that all evidence was legally obtained and relevant to prosecution. Mr. Morrison was acting as a cooperating witness with federal investigators, the judge states. His evidence gathering was authorized and essential to exposing systematic criminal activity. Jennifer Walsh's upcoming testimony about the internal cover-up promises to be devastating. Marcus Sterling's cooperation provides insider details about murder conspiracies. But prosecutors emphasize that my testimony about Greg's character and motivations will give the case its emotional weight. Juries need to understand who Greg really was, Kim explains during preparation sessions. Not the criminal the defense will try to portray, but the whistleblower who died protecting innocent people from corporate predators. The victim impact statements are heartbreaking. Elderly retirees who lost everything. Families whose college savings vanished. Workers whose pensions were stolen to finance executive bonuses. Each story reinforces why Greg couldn't walk away from this fight. Defense attorneys file motion after motion, trying to exclude evidence, delay proceedings, and discredit witnesses. They challenge Greg's mental state, question his motivations, and suggest he was motivated by personal financial gain rather than justice. They're desperate, Agent Williams tells me after another contentious hearing. The evidence is overwhelming, so they're trying to create reasonable doubt through character, assassination, and procedural challenges. The prosecution's case is methodical and devastating. Financial experts explain how the fraud worked. FBI agents detail the murder conspiracy. Victims describe the impact of losing their life savings. Each piece of evidence builds toward an inevitable conclusion, but the defense's attacks on Greg's character are painful to hear. They describe him as unstable, greedy, and willing to fabricate evidence for personal gain. Listening to lawyers disparage my dead husband while his killers sit smugly at the defense table tests every limit of my self-control. Remember, Kim reminds me before I testify, your job is to show the jury who Greg really was. Let his actions and sacrifices speak louder than the defense's lies. The trial represents more than legal proceedings. It's a battle for Greg's legacy and a test of whether justice can prevail against wealth and power. The forensic evidence confirms what we suspected: Greg was murdered using a sophisticated poison delivered through the wine service at his hotel. The toxicology report becomes the key artifact that transforms this from a fraud case into a capital murder prosecution. Dr. Sarah Chen, the FBI's forensic toxicologist, explains the murder method to prosecutors. The victim was poisoned with a compound called batrachotoxin, derived from certain South American frogs. It causes cardiac arrest within 2 to 4 hours of consumption, and unless specifically tested for, appears to be natural heart failure. The poison was administered in a bottle of wine delivered to Greg's hotel room at 11:40 p.m., wine he didn't order, delivered by someone who wasn't a regular hotel employee. This wasn't a crime of passion, Agent Williams tells me as we review the evidence. Someone researched exotic poisons, hired a professional killer, arranged false employment at the hotel, and coordinated the security camera malfunction. This was a carefully planned execution. The investigation reveals the full scope of the conspiracy. Phone records show CEO Blackwood contacted a man named Yuri Petrov, who has connections to international assassination networks. Bank records show $250,000 transferred to an offshore account controlled by Petrov 3 days before Greg's death. Petrov specializes in murders that appear natural, Agent Williams explains. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents. He's been linked to at least 12 suspicious deaths across 7 countries, but never prosecuted because his methods are so sophisticated. The hotel employee who disabled the security cameras was paid $50,000 to create a technical malfunction during the exact window when Greg was murdered. The fake room service worker disappeared immediately after delivering the poisoned wine and has never been found. Greg knew he was in danger. Agent Williams shows me Greg's final phone calls. His last conversation with Jennifer Walsh shows he was aware of being followed. But he completed his mission anyway, ensuring that evidence of Meridian's crimes would survive even if he didn't. The murder conspiracy included multiple levels of coordination. Meridian executives provided funding and authorization. International criminals provided expertise and execution. Corrupt hotel employees provided access and cover. This wasn't just corporate fraud, federal prosecutor Kim explains. This was organized crime with international connections. The defendants crossed the line from white-collar criminals to murderers when they decided Greg's investigation threatened their operation. The poison analysis report shows traces of batrachotoxin in Greg's blood, wine residue in his hotel room, and contact residue on the wine bottle delivered by the fake room service worker. The evidence chain is unbreakable, but perhaps most damning is Greg's own prediction. In his final recording, made just hours before his death, he documented his suspicions about being followed and his fear that Meridian executives might kill him. "If I'm found dead from apparent heart failure," Greg's voice says on the recording, "please investigate thoroughly. I'm a healthy 38-year-old man with no history of cardiac problems. If I die suddenly while investigating corporate crime, it won't be coincidental." The recording continues, "I've documented everything, the fraud, the cover-up, and the threats against whistleblowers. If something happens to me, this evidence must reach federal prosecutors. The victims of these crimes deserve justice, even if I don't survive to see it achieved." Listening to Greg predict his own murder is devastating, but it also provides crucial evidence of premeditation by his killers. The murder charges carry potential death penalties, raising the stakes for everyone involved. Blackwood and two other executives face federal capital charges for ordering Greg's assassination. Defense attorneys argue that Greg's death was suicide motivated by guilt over his alleged embezzlement, but the forensic evidence makes this impossible to believe. Batrachotoxin isn't available commercially, can't be obtained accidentally, and wouldn't be chosen by someone attempting suicide. The defendants hired international assassins to murder a federal witness, prosecutor Kim tells the court. This represents the most serious possible escalation of corporate crime, from theft to murder to protect criminal profits. Greg wasn't just Meridian's fraud victim, he was their murder victim, killed because his investigation threatened to expose crimes worth nearly $100 million. The poison analysis report provides scientific proof that my husband was executed by corporate criminals who valued money more than human life. The federal courthouse is packed with fraud victims, their families, media representatives, and FBI agents who worked on the investigation. Judge Patricia Morrison maintains strict order as prosecutors present their case against the men who ordered my husband's murder. The opening statements set the stakes clearly. Federal prosecutor Kim describes a criminal enterprise that stole nearly $100 million from innocent victims and murdered anyone who threatened to expose their crimes. Defense attorneys respond with desperate deflection, claiming Greg was an unstable employee who fabricated evidence to cover his own embezzlement. They argue his death was suicide motivated by guilt and impending exposure, but their argument collapses when prosecutors present Greg's final video testimony, the key artifact that speaks from beyond the grave. The courtroom falls silent as Greg's image appears on screens throughout the room. He's sitting in what I recognize as his hotel room, recording on his phone just days before his death. "My name is Gregory Morrison," his voice fills the courtroom. "I'm recording this testimony because I believe Meridian financial executives may kill me to prevent exposure of their criminal activities." Greg's recorded voice continues, "For 6 months, I've documented systematic fraud involving nearly $100 million stolen from retirement accounts, pension funds, and college savings. I've cooperated with FBI investigators and gathered evidence that will ensure these criminals face justice." The video shows Greg displaying documents, playing audio recordings, and explaining the sophisticated methods Meridian used to steal from vulnerable clients. "I know this recording might be played after my death," Greg says, looking directly into the camera. "If that happens, Please understand that I couldn't ignore the suffering of innocent people when I had the power to help them. Whatever consequences I face, stopping these criminals is worth the risk." Several jurors wipe away tears as Greg's final words echo through the courtroom. Even the defense attorneys look uncomfortable watching a dead man predict his own murder. The prosecution methodically presents evidence over the following days. Financial experts explain the fraud mechanisms. FBI agents detail the murder conspiracy. Fraud victims describe losing their life savings to finance executive bonuses and luxury lifestyles. Jennifer Walsh's testimony about the internal cover-up is devastating. She describes executives laughing about maximizing extraction from retirement sheep and planning to blame Greg posthumously for their crimes. Marcus Sterling's cooperation provides insider details about the murder conspiracy. His recorded conversations with CEO Blackwood include explicit discussions about eliminating the Morrison problem permanently. But the most powerful testimony comes from the fraud victims themselves. Elderly retirees who lost everything. Families whose children can't attend college because their savings vanished. Workers whose pensions were stolen to pay for executive country club memberships. "They didn't just steal our money," testifies Margaret Peterson, the 84-year-old woman whose entire retirement fund was taken. "They stole our dignity, our security, our ability to live independently. These men destroyed our lives for their profit." When my turn comes to testify, the courtroom is packed beyond capacity. I take the witness stand knowing that Greg's legacy depends on my ability to show the jury who he really was. "Your Honor," I begin, "my husband died because he cared more about justice than his own safety. He couldn't sleep at night knowing that innocent families were being robbed while he stayed silent." I describe Greg's character, his integrity, his inability to ignore suffering when he had the power to help. I explain how his secret investigation wasn't betrayal of our marriage, but expression of the values that made me fall in love with him. Greg knew he was in danger, I tell the jury, but he also knew he was the only person positioned to gather evidence that could stop these crimes. He chose to protect strangers he'd never met rather than protect himself. The defense's cross-examination is brutal. They try to portray Greg as unstable, greedy, and willing to fabricate evidence. They suggest our marriage was failing and Greg was motivated by personal financial problems, but their attacks only reinforce Greg's heroism. Every question about his suspicious behavior reveals another aspect of his investigation. Every suggestion of improper motivation is contradicted by evidence of his cooperation with federal authorities. "Mrs. Morrison," the defense attorney asks, "isn't it true that your husband was under enormous financial pressure?" "Yes," I respond, "because he was spending his own money to travel across the country, meeting with fraud victims and gathering evidence at personal expense. Greg bankrupted himself fighting for justice." The prosecution's rebuttal is powerful. They show Greg's financial records, proving he spent over $30,000 of personal savings on investigation expenses. They present his correspondence with victims, demonstrating genuine concern for their suffering. Most importantly, they play Greg's final phone call to me, recorded 2 hours before his death. "Sophia, I love you more than life itself," Greg's voice says. "If something happens to me, please know that everything I've done was to protect innocent people from criminals. I couldn't live with myself if I stayed silent while families lost their futures." The trial represents more than legal proceedings, it's a battle between truth and lies, between justice and profit, between Greg's legacy and his killer's freedom. The guilty verdicts come after 4 days of jury deliberation. The newspaper headline announcing the convictions becomes the artifact that validates Greg's sacrifice and ensures his legacy. Meridian executives convicted, CEO faces life sentence. For murder conspiracy, reads the front page of the morning paper. Below the headline, a photo shows CEO Richard Blackwood in handcuffs, his expensive suit unable to disguise his defeat. The verdicts are comprehensive and devastating. CEO Richard Blackwood, guilty on all counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, fraud, and money laundering. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours on the murder charge. Greg's video testimony and the forensic evidence made the conspiracy undeniable. CFO Marcus Sterling, guilty of fraud and racketeering. But the jury accepts his cooperation and finds him not guilty of murder conspiracy. His testimony against Blackwood proved crucial to the prosecution's case. 3 Other executives, guilty of various fraud and conspiracy charges, with sentences ranging from wire fraud to racketeering participation. Judge Patricia Morrison's sentencing is swift and severe. This court has rarely seen such callous disregard for human life and dignity, she states. The defendants stole the life savings of vulnerable people and murdered a federal witness to protect their criminal profits. Blackwood receives life in prison without possibility of parole for the murder conspiracy, plus 40 years for financial crimes. Even if he somehow survived the murder sentence, he would die in federal prison. The other executives receive sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. Sterling, whose cooperation was crucial to convicting the murderers, receives 12 years and must forfeit all assets obtained through criminal activity, but perhaps more importantly, the court orders full restitution to fraud victims. The government will liquidate Meridian's assets, recover money from offshore accounts, and establish a victim compensation fund using the criminals' personal wealth. Every dollar stolen from victims will be recovered and returned, Judge Morrison announces. These defendants' mansions, luxury cars, country club memberships, and offshore accounts will be sold to compensate the families they robbed. The restitution process is comprehensive. Blackwood's $4.2 million home, his collection of luxury vehicles, his art collection, and his wife's jewelry, all purchased with stolen money, will be auctioned to fund victim compensation. Federal agents have already frozen accounts in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg containing nearly $30 million in stolen funds. Recovery specialists estimate that 90% of the stolen money can be returned to victims within 18 months. Margaret Peterson, the 84-year-old woman whose retirement fund was stolen, approaches me after the sentencing. "Your husband saved my life," she says with tears in her eyes. "I thought I would die in poverty because of what they did to me. But Greg's investigation will give me back my dignity." The fraud victims' reaction to the verdicts is overwhelmingly emotional. Many have waited years for justice, watching their life savings disappear while the criminals lived in luxury. Greg's investigation finally gave them answers, accountability, and hope for financial recovery. Agent Williams finds me after the sentencing. "Mrs. Morrison, your husband's investigation led to the largest financial fraud prosecution in federal court history. His evidence will be used as a model for future white-collar crime cases. The convictions validate everything Greg believed about the importance of fighting injustice. He died to protect people he'd never met, and his sacrifice ensured that corporate criminals faced consequences while victims received justice. But the verdicts represent more than legal victory. They prove that ordinary people can challenge powerful corruption and win, even when victory requires the ultimate sacrifice." Local news coverage focuses on the human impact. Retirement funds will be restored. College savings will be recovered. Families will regain their financial security. Because one man couldn't ignore their suffering. Gregory Morrison died a hero, the newspaper editorial states. His investigation exposed corporate crime, led to historic convictions, and ensured that nearly $100 million in stolen money will be returned to victims. His legacy will protect vulnerable people from financial predators for generations. As I leave the courthouse, holding the newspaper that announces justice for Greg's murder, I realize that his death wasn't the end of his fight against injustice. It was the beginning of accountability for corporate criminals who thought wealth and power made them untouchable. The guilty verdicts prove that Greg's sacrifice had meaning, that his investigation achieved its purpose, and that sometimes the greatest love is expressed through willingness to die for strangers who needed protection. 6 months after the trial, I stand in front of a memorial plaque dedicated to Greg at the federal building. The bronze plaque serves as the final artifact of our journey, a permanent reminder that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice. Gregory Morrison, whistleblower, hero, defender of justice. His courage ensured that corporate criminals faced consequences and fraud victims received justice. The plaque is mounted in the lobby where FBI agents and federal prosecutors pass daily, a reminder that some fights are worth any sacrifice. The Greg Morrison Foundation for Financial Justice has been established using the reward money the FBI paid for information leading to the convictions. The foundation helps fraud victims navigate legal systems, provides assistance to whistleblowers, and educates people about protecting themselves from investment scams. Jennifer Walsh has become the foundation's first executive director, using her insider knowledge of corporate fraud to help other victims understand how they were victimized. Greg would be proud of what you've built, she tells me as we review grant applications from fraud victims seeking legal assistance. Marcus Sterling, after serving his reduced sentence, will work as a consultant helping other fraud victims understand how corporate crime operates. His cooperation in convicting murderers earned him a chance at redemption, which he seems determined to embrace. I can't undo what I did, he tells me during a foundation meeting, but I can spend the rest of my life helping victims recover from crimes like the ones I participated in. Agent Williams visits monthly to update me on related investigations. Greg's evidence continues leading to prosecutions of other financial criminals, money launderers, and corrupt officials who enabled Meridian's crimes. Your husband's investigation has spawned 12 additional federal cases, she reports. His methods are being taught at the FBI Academy as the gold standard for financial crime investigation. The house Greg and I shared is finally beginning to feel like home again instead of a crime scene. I've turned his office into a workspace for the foundation, surrounded by pictures of fraud victims we've helped and letters from families who recovered their stolen savings. Margaret Peterson sends Christmas cards now, thanking Greg posthumously for giving her back her retirement security. Julia Chen's mother completed cancer treatment using medical insurance she could afford because her pension fund was recovered. Maria Santos's father died peacefully knowing his construction pension would support his widow. Each success story validates Greg's sacrifice and proves that his investigation achieved its intended purpose, protecting innocent people from corporate predators, but the most meaningful change is internal. I've learned that Greg's secret life wasn't a betrayal of our marriage, it was the ultimate expression of the values that made me fall in love with him. His lies protected me from danger while he fought for justice. His sacrifice gave meaning to his death and hope to people who had lost everything. Standing in our kitchen, looking at the renovation Greg completed with such care, I finally understand the full scope of what he accomplished. He didn't just expose financial criminals or recover stolen money. He proved that ordinary people can fight powerful corruption and win, even when victory costs everything. The foundation has helped 127 fraud victims recover over $23 million in stolen funds. We've connected 12 whistleblowers with legal protection. We've educated thousands of people about recognizing and avoiding investment scams. Greg's investigation began with one man's inability to ignore injustice. It ended with justice for hundreds of victims, life sentences for murderers, and a foundation that will protect vulnerable people from financial predators for decades to come. I keep Greg's wedding ring on a chain around my neck, close to my heart where his memory lives. Sometimes, when I'm working late on foundation business, I feel his presence in the room, not as a ghost, but as a reminder that love sometimes requires sacrifice, and sacrifice sometimes achieves immortality. My husband died on a business trip. That wasn't really a business trip. He was killed by executives at a company where he didn't really work. But the truth he died to protect has transformed the lives of everyone he sought to help. The memorial plaque bears his name, but Greg's real monument is the lives he saved, the justice he achieved, and the hope he gave to people who thought powerful criminals were untouchable. If you've ever wondered whether one person can make a difference against seemingly impossible odds, Greg's story is your answer. Sometimes the greatest love is expressed not through what we say, but through what we're willing to sacrifice for justice. Like and subscribe if this story reminded you that heroes walk among us, often in ways we don't recognize until it's too late to thank them properly. Greg's legacy lives on in every victim who recovers their stolen future, and in every whistleblower who finds courage to fight injustice because they know they're not alone.